the public and the American political system. And what I want to do, I want to give you a schematic view on the American political system and then drill down into one portion of it. Now, everybody knows that we have a system of checks and balances with a separation of powers. And that's our system of government. Here's the federal government. We have three branches: the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. And they overlap in certain ways, and we'll look at, in this class, after today, how each of these works and then how they interact. Also, outside of this is the government bureaucracy. The government is not just composed of public officials, elected officials in Congress, right? This is the legislative branch is Congress. The judicial branch is all of the federal courts, not just the Supreme Court, but all federal courts. And the executive branch is not just the president, it's actually a very large and diverse organization, with the president kind of at the head of it, but also kind of not at the head of it. So we'll see all this stuff. But there's also, intertwined with this entire system, a bureaucracy of people who work for the federal government. And there are also soldiers, which I, in terms of the scheme, consider part of the bureaucracy, right? They're out there. When you shoot a gun at somebody, you're doing the same thing as somebody who fills out a form is doing. I mean, it's not the same thing, but in terms of government function, they're just carrying out the decisions that are made by these people. These people are the decision makers. These are the decision implementers. Both of them have an important role. This is not the only part of our system. And in fact, what the U.S. has is a federal system, so that we have a second set of governments, state governments. And the state governments have the exact same overall structure: legislature, judicial, executive, and a bureaucracy. And in fact, what's strange about the American political system is that when, from the point of view of your life and your interactions, this is the level of government that is more relevant. When you get a parking ticket, when you go to the DMV, when you pay your property taxes, when you get pulled over for speeding, when you come to school, it's the state government that you're dealing with. Most laws, most crimes, most prisoners, most taxes and fines go to the state government. Now, this is a U.S. government class, so we focus on the federal government, and there is a state and local government class. One of the problems with our system and with that class, has anybody taken Poli-Sci 203? It's hard to talk about state and local government the same way you do about the federal government, because there's a lot of diversity. While every one of our state governments has this same basic structure, there are big differences. Some states, the judicial branch, have their Supreme Court justices are elected to 14-year terms. And some of them, they're elected to 6-year terms. At the federal level, our judges are appointed for life, not elected to a particular term. There are a couple states that have appointed judges. And the judicial system in the states varies widely. Right? If you've ever lived in more than one state and interacted with the criminal justice system, which many people do, you'll realize how different it is. These two things, though, are a mirror of each other. We have shared responsibility, and there are power struggles. Our system is a very weird system, a federal system where there are two levels of government, the national government and the state governments. There are political struggles that are created between the levels of government. We don't have a nice, neatly, hierarchically organized system where the national government is superior to the state government, is superior to the local government. The state government is superior to local governments. The states create counties, municipalities. If the Portland School Board exercises any power, that's because the state legislature, the Oregon State Legislature, has given it that power. And it can always take that power away or change it. That's not true for the state of Oregon in relation to the national government. There are certain things that the national government can never take away from the state of Oregon. And Oregon doesn't have power because it was given to it by the national government. In fact, in our system, the states came first, and the states created the federal government. Not to be above them, but to take care of a set of problems that the states themselves couldn't take care of. That created a power struggle. Now, in this class, we won't look at the issue of federalism. That's for Poli-Sci 201. There's a lot of stuff in this that are relevant to American government that we won't look at that's part of Poli-Sci 201. But just know that this is here. Now, there's a three-part division of both of these. We also have the basic structure of the American political system in general is three-part. This is the people. So we've got three major players, if you want to think of it that way. The federal government, the state governments, which they're diverse, but we can think of them kind of collectively, and then the people. The people have an influence over these two governments. That's what democracy is about. And then, of course, these governments have power and control over the people. That's the interplay that makes for a democracy. In a dictatorship, the influence is there too, but it's not as formal. Right? Dictators have to worry about the people, but in a different way than politicians in a democracy do. Right? If you're a dictator, you have to worry that the people are going to revolt, or that the military is going to have a coup, or that people are going to stop working and stop paying taxes. That's a very different thing that politicians in the democratic system have to worry about. And the nice thing about democracy is that this influence is far more direct and more routine than in a dictatorship. But we do still have the same relationship that the governments have power over us, as you know, right? You should be aware of it. And in fact, one of the things that is even hard to conceptualize is how much power the government has over us. Almost everything you do is regulated. I'm reminded of it every day because I hate the freeway. And the reason I hate the freeway is, one, because everybody's in my way, and I want them to get the hell out of my way so I can get where I'm going. But two, I can't go as fast as I want. When there's no cars, my instinct, my impulse as a human being on a freeway free of cars is to go as fast as I can. And if there's somebody in the so-called fast lane who's going 75 miles an hour, and there's the right lane free, I get in that lane and I blow past them. But I'm not free to do that because I get tickets. And I most recently got a ticket like a month ago because I want to go as fast as I want to go. But the man keeps me down. The government tells me I can't go 110 miles an hour on I-5 through Portland. I want to, and the only reason I don't is not because there are cars in my way, and that's true today. I was not going to go 110 miles an hour today, but is because of the power the government exercises over us. That's a daily reminder to me that the man is keeping us down. But why does the man keep us down? Why is the government telling us that we can't speed? Because if I go 110 miles an hour and lose control and wreck and kill a bunch of people or injure them, destroy their property, then I have violated their rights. The government is actually regulating us and doing all kinds of stuff to us to protect us from each other. Policy changes all the time. Sometimes it changes slowly in some areas. Sometimes it changes frustratingly slowly or not at all. If you are a pro-life person, the Roe versus Wade hasn't changed. And it's frustrating to you that despite the fact that you and lots of people who share your belief think that abortion should be illegal because it's murder, that hasn't changed. But that policy could change. It changed once when Roe versus Wade was ruled, and it could change again. Politics is a part of a big struggle. Now, part of the struggle is between the people and the two levels of government. But a big part of the struggle occurs here. And what I want to do today is talk about the people in more detail. Now, to keep things consistent, and I think it works, but also as a memory device, we can divide the governments into three parts, and I think it's very useful to look at the people as having three parts also. The people is everybody. There are voters, which are not everybody, as you know. Now, this is not to scale, okay? And I couldn't even make it to scale because the size of the pool of voters expands and contracts from election to election. Right? So this is schematic, not to scale. You probably understood that. There are voters, and voters are obviously really, really important because one of the primary ways that the people influence the government is through elections. One of the biggest mistakes, though, in understanding democracy is reducing democracy to elections. That's not all there is to a democratic political system. It's primary, and it's fundamental, but it's not the only thing. And in fact, it's probably not the most important thing because elections happen every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years if you're in the Senate. They happen sometimes every year at state level. They happen sporadically, though. What happens in between is democratic politics just as much as elections are. And that's because the people also are involved in interest groups. Interest groups influence politicians through various kinds of activities. One of them is lobbying, and another one is social activism, or excuse me, political activism. How many of you have ever been to a protest? You're a member of an interest group attempting to influence the government between elections. It's really important because politicians, they worry about elections. That's one of the things, and it's fundamental because you don't get to go back to office and make decisions year after year if you don't win an election. But you also have to pay attention to, partly because they influence elections, but partly because they influence the entire environment you live in, you have to pay attention to what interest groups are doing. Protests are an attempt by a group of people who share a common interest. That's what an interest group is. It's a shared view, or value, or policy. It depends. Who here belongs to the NRA, National Rifle Association? The NRA is an extraordinarily diverse organization. It's an interest group because all of the people who belong to it share one view, but not every view. And in fact, the NRA, the difference between the leadership and the rank and file membership is the leadership of the NRA is very strongly anti-gun regulation, and the membership is less strongly anti-gun regulation. So everybody in the NRA shares a concern about gun laws, and they share an interest in making sure that Americans can have access to weapons. Different views on what the rules of that access should be, but they have a shared view. Not even a shared policy, specifically, where they're like, okay, here's the one thing that we want. Usually, to have a shared policy, something that the group agrees on specifically, requires a smaller interest group. Interest groups range in size, and they range in pursuits and in the kind of interests. Companies and organizations of companies are interest groups. The Corn Growers of America, that's an interest group. They share certain kinds of interests. What's interesting about corporate interest groups is that corporations are in competition with each other, and yet they also have shared interests. Politics in a democratic system is about elections, and it's majority rule, and that's true. But that's not all it is. What's most true, more true, on a daily basis, and these things have a tremendous amount of influence, is that democratic politics is really the struggle among interest groups. That's what democratic politics is. Now, there's a huge relationship between the struggle among interest groups and elections. Ultimately, in a democratic system, the power is held by the representatives who are elected. So the outcomes, in other words, what gets done, is decided by elected officials. And so elections are fundamental. But the outcome of those elections is heavily influenced by interest groups. If you've ever knocked on a door, ever put a sign on your lawn, or put a bumper sticker, or talked to somebody about who they should vote for, you're a member of an interest group trying to influence the political system. In that case, directly through influencing the electoral system. So a lot of what goes on is there's actually internal influence. Interest groups are trying to convince voters. If you're the NRA, you want to convince voters to vote for pro-gun rights candidates. If you're a member of Greenpeace, you want to convince voters to vote for pro-environmentalist candidates. That's part of what you're doing. You're also trying to influence both levels of government, both the state and the federal government. You're trying to influence political officials. So interest groups are looking in two different ways. Now, voters are also trying to influence political officials. That's what you're doing. When you vote, you're taking your most direct method of influencing elected officials. Though it's a very blunt mechanism. And we'll see this time and again as we look at the behavior of politicians, particularly in the legislature. It's a very blunt instrument. You don't get, at the federal level, to make your vote speak for a specific idea or issue. Now, that's one of the big differences between states and the federal government, is that part of the influence that people have over state governments, not every state, but 36 states, and Oregon included, and Oregon was the first, so we can be proud of that. Many states have the initiative and referendum, which is a way that citizens can vote directly on issues. Right? Do you think that people who are the same sex should get married? Do you think that there should be taxes increased to pay for more money for schools? Do you think that this bridge should get built? States and localities ask these kinds of questions of voters, and so voters actually get to decide on policy directly. We don't have a mechanism like that at the federal level. Elections at the federal level are all about candidates only. The American people do not get to decide on policy. Do you think that we should have a public option? Yes. Will you ever get to vote on that? No. Not without a constitutional amendment. Mostly, our influence, our voting, is only about candidates. That's it. That's a pretty slim form of influence over the government for a lot of reasons. So you vote for a Democrat, or you vote for a Republican. What does your vote tell that person? All it tells you is that you consent to be governed by them. You consent, you accept that they get to make decisions in your name. That's all you're saying. If you're a politician and somebody votes for you, does it tell you that they approve of your stand on abortion or taxes or the environment? No. And in fact, politicians would like to know that. They would like to have better information about what it is the voters do and don't approve of. And that's why politicians actually, as candidates, raise money and pay for polls so they can figure out what people think so that they can continue getting voted for. Because if, for example, if I'm a Republican and you vote for me and I win the election, I want to know if you voted for me because of my stance against government regulation and my view on taxes, or I want to know if you voted for me because the Democrat has screwed up and you don't like that person. Because if it's that, then I have to do something to survive that's different than if you approve of my position on government regulation and taxes. You don't get to make a fine distinction. And given that we have a two-party system, you don't even get to make a very big choice. If you vote for a third-party candidate, a non-Democrat and non-Republican, you're throwing away your vote. Now, you're not throwing away your vote in the sense that it goes nowhere, but you're never going to get the winner. We're only ever going to have Democrats and Republicans win. If you want your vote to count towards the winner, not towards some symbolic protest, which actually, political activism, voting for a third-party candidate is a form of political activism, actually. All those middle-aged dads who voted for Ross Perot in 1992, all those guys, they said something. They didn't get the president elected. They said something very powerful. They didn't get the winner. But it's not a form of electoral power. You get to choose realistically between a Democrat and a Republican. Not about issues, not about any specific set of ideas, but just a very blunt choice. So as voters, our influence over the political system is primary. It's fundamental, but it's also pretty blunt and remote. It doesn't say a lot. It's not very clear. It's sporadic, and it is not the main thing that influences the behavior of politicians. They always have to look over their shoulders at the voter. That's true. But they're looking over their shoulders more strongly at interest groups. Partly because interest groups have influence between elections, and partly because interest groups, and largely because interest groups actually have a large role in convincing voters. So interest group struggle is what politics is all about. Now, the third group here in this diagram is the media. Now, all of these are made up of people, and they're overlapping because they mix. There are many voters who belong to interest groups. It's possible that there are people who belong to interest groups who aren't voters, people who belong to the NRA who don't actually vote, people who belong to a pro-life or a pro-choice organization, or who give money to Amnesty International, who don't vote. It's not only possible, it's true. But mostly, if you're a member of an interest group, you're probably going to be a voter. So again, schematically, this bubble should be big, right? And this should be small. Members of the media, and the media are just people who provide information. That's what the media is. It's not necessarily a New York Times reporter. That's one person who's in the media. Does anybody here have a blog? Yeah, you're a member of the media. You're maybe not a member of the mass media or the mainstream media, though I myself am a Twitterer, and I have 23 followers. And so I consider myself part of the media, but not obviously part of the mass media. Now I'm looking to expand my influence. And if I expanded my influence 100-fold and I had 2,300 followers, I would be extremely happy. I still wouldn't be part of the mass media. The media are people who provide information. Now, obviously, many people in the media are also voters, though not all, right? And also many people in the media are members of interest groups. They're not purely objective. In fact, one of the things that's changed with the rise of highly ideological media as well as with new media, where Zeke is part of the media too, and so am I, is that the overlap between interest groups and the media has become larger over time. Fox News was really the first mainstream mass media to adopt a perspective that was oriented toward a particular set of interest groups. There is a great diversity, much like there's a great diversity of interest groups, there's a great diversity of media and its relationship to interest groups. There are plenty of liberal media outlets, there are plenty of conservative media outlets, there are also plenty of media outlets that are dedicated to being as objective as possible. And there are many media outlets that are dedicated to very specific kinds of things. Right? Not all media are political media, though from the point of view of this class, it's really the political media that is most important. The goal of the media is, like the goals of interest groups, highly diverse. But one thing we can say is that while interest groups, they're doing two main things. They're trying to convince voters, and they're trying to influence political officials. And actually, those two things are connected. One of the ways that you influence political officials is by influencing voters. The Tea Party movement is a very influential interest group because politicians pay attention to what the Tea Party wants, because the Tea Party is successful convincing voters to vote for Tea Party type candidates. So there's a connection. But interest groups point in two ways: at voters and at elected officials. The media does the same thing. But mostly what the media does is informs voters. And it informs the people too, but we don't care about the people, right? The generic people. Only from the point of view of politics do we care about actual voters. Right? The people are only a concern of politicians insofar as there's the possibility of a revolution or widespread tax fraud or tax resistance. Same kind of concern in a dictatorship. But generally, politicians are concerned about voters and interest groups. Now, obviously, they're concerned about the media because if the media plays a major role in informing voters, then what the media does is of paramount importance to politicians. So the media's influence is indirect. There's not a direct, the media doesn't lobby, the media doesn't get involved in political activism. The media is influential through other influencers. Now, what often happens is that interest groups will use the media as part of their way of convincing voters. And in fact, it's very difficult not to use the media. Now, that's not the only way to get them. If you have a subscriber list, if you have a newsletter, you can reach your target people directly. If you get, and I get these, I don't know why I never unsubscribe. I get the MoveOn.org emails. I get the Credo emails. And it's just because it's so much easier to delete it than it is to actually then unsubscribe, even though unsubscribing is like 2 seconds more. I'm just too lazy to actually unsubscribe. And partly because I like to see what the liberal interest groups, what they want me to tell politicians. Write Jeff Merkley immediately and tell him to, whatever. Like I don't want to ever write Jeff Merkley based on what Credo is telling me to write, but I like to see what they're saying. But they can reach people directly, but a good way is to work through the media. Now, what is the media designed to do? Provide information. It does so in many different ways, but there's one major dynamic that's important about this relationship between the media and the voters. It informs, but the media has to capture an audience. I don't care how insightful and rousing your blog posts are, Zeke. It has to speak to people, right? And why is Ann Coulter known? Why does she have, I don't know, like 75,000 Twitter followers and however many people who read her books and her columns? Why? What she's doing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, speaks to people. It captures an audience. Right? Why is a squirrel that jumps up and bites some kid on the nuts, that video, why is that viral on YouTube? I don't know. Because it's entertaining, because it captures an audience. In a way, what captures an audience is what captures an audience. If you could figure out what captures an audience, you would be powerful and wealthy. Television executives make a lot of money and have power over our media because somebody believes that they're able to do this, but they're not that good at it either. Right? Nobody sat down and said, we've got this awesome idea that will be a huge popular hit for a decade. People will love it. It will influence our culture. We'll call it Friends. Right? No one could predict that Friends was going to be a decade-long popular sitcom. They just made it up. And it worked. Right? All of those other sitcoms that didn't work, gone. Better ideas. There was this great sketch comedy program that was on for like 15 minutes in the early 90s called The State. I don't know, usually it's like, oh, there's one person who knows The State. The State was the funniest, smartest, most awesome thing. And all the State people have gone on to do other things. But The State didn't work. Why? Because it didn't capture an audience, right? Why is Fox News popular? Because it captures an audience. Right?
Rupert Murdoch exploits fear and hyperbole.
Right, and that's what works. He doesn't exploit it, he just does it, and people respond to it, right? Human beings respond to a lot of different things. Why is Oprah like one of the most influential cultural figures ever? Because what Oprah does works with an audience, right? So there are lots of things that capture an audience, and in fact, I've given you a couple of examples of big things, but it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be viral. You don't have to have a viral video. You don't have to have the top-rated show. It doesn't have to be Friends or Oprah. Whatever actually captures some audience works. Now, there are also, again, the diversity here is huge. And this is, in the 20 years I've been teaching American politics, the diversity has changed. It used to be that the media was the mainstream media. You couldn't reach anybody. I mean, you had your possibility of your little pirate radio station, whatever it was. But you couldn't reach anybody unless you had control over massive resources. But now, what captures an audience is very diverse and has been fragmented, and there's all kinds of different sources. And in fact, as a media consumer, as a person who is a voter, or a potential voter, you probably have a lot of different sources of information. Right? The sources that people have are very diverse. The media, though, is informing people. Now, some people in the media are trying to inform in a specific way, and some are simply informing by putting stuff out there. There's no monolithic influence. In a way, the media reflects the diversity and the struggle of interest groups. There's a ton of information. Because the media itself, as the name should imply, is not itself a force. It's a medium. It's something that things flow through. If you want to be successful in the interest group struggle, you have to be media successful, media savvy. Now, you don't necessarily have to know what you're doing. The Tea Party didn't know what it was doing. This was one of the things that was interesting. The Tea Party was media friendly because it was a bunch of middle-aged white people wearing wigs and walking around with signs that didn't make any sense, right? Government hands off my Medicare. Like, really? You don't know that Medicare is a government program? That was my favorite stupid sign from the Tea Party movement. But it didn't matter. Nobody in the Tea Party was able to say, oh, here's what will work. It just worked because it made good TV, it made good blog posts, it made good conversation, it makes good examples in class, right? Now, that's not to say that members of different interest groups can't get more media savvy, or that they aren't. The NRA, an example I like to use a lot, the NRA is extraordinarily media savvy, right? And they have a very highly professional media public relations operation. And that's because the NRA is a very much more narrowly focused, as well as centuries-old interest group. The struggle between these groups for influence to convince voters to vote for candidates that will do the bidding of their groups, and not do the bidding in a conspiratorial way, but just vote for policies that they like. And the struggle of interest groups to have a direct influence on the government through lobbying and political activism is carried out to a large extent through the media. How do politicians learn about what people think? Well, one of the ways is by watching the news and reading the newspaper. and also reading things that come to them through interest groups. Politicians also will directly try to read the people by paying for polls that will tell them what is going on. Right? What do the voters think? What do the voters like? What issues matter to them? If you're a politician and you want to succeed, if you want to be adaptive to the environment of electoral politics, you need to know what the voters are going to do and how they're going to respond. Focus groups, polls, political strategists, all of these help politicians figure out how the people will respond. But one of the big sources of influence, of information for politicians is the media. So what the media actually does is the media provides information. It informs public officials also. Now, just as interest groups use the media to convince voters, political officials also use media to convince voters. The media is a conduit. It's a medium. It's a very diverse one. It is an important environmental factor. One of the things about Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008 was that it was the first campaign that made successful use of social media as well as new media like streaming video, particularly streaming video. Right? That campaign's success at using a new form of this conduit to potential voters is still being studied. In a way, it was a groundbreaking operation, and it was lucky. It wasn't that they knew what they were doing. It was like Friends. It just worked. They created this sitcom that was just a smash hit because it spoke well. Now there were people who knew what they were doing, who understood, insofar as anybody can understand how social media actually works, right? But no one fully understands. Social media is an organism that is, not controllable. Even what's the guy with the curly hair? Mark Zuckerberg. Even he has what, 150,000 friends or whatever it is. But he can't control Facebook. He can mess it up. He can change it and make it less friendly and more annoying, and the privacy policy can change. But even he doesn't understand. The guy who created it doesn't understand how to fully utilize and exploit Facebook. Twitter, for sure, the people who invented Twitter, they weren't trying to create this worldwide phenomenon of this microblog that has 100 million users producing 6 billion tweets every day. They didn't intend to do that, and they certainly don't have any control over the way that Twitter actually functions. This is an environmental factor that's beyond people's control. Public officials get information, and they try to use it. The better you are at working through the media, the more successful you will be. That much is clear. As an interest group, the more media savvy and more media friendly you are, the more influence you will have on voters. One of the differences between the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street is that the Tea Party was more media friendly, not necessarily more media savvy, but more media friendly for whatever reason. It made better TV. The Occupy Wall Street didn't quite ever take off as the kind of phenomenon. Now it's young and it's early, and that may change. And certainly the people who are affiliated with Occupy Wall Street are trying to figure this out. They're trying to say, how can we get the kind of influence that we deserve? There are so many more of us than those crazy Tea Party nutballs, yet they have a lot of influence and we don't. In a large measure, that's not because there's fewer of them. There are more of them. It's not because their ideas are less compelling, because their ideas are probably more compelling, but at least as compelling. It's because this particular conduit has not been exploited as successfully, for whatever reason. Why do people love McDonald's hamburgers? Why? Because, now this is a case where things have been designed. The McDonald's hamburger is a miracle of food engineering. It is designed to trigger every single one of our stimulus responses. It has a gigantic amount of sugar in it. But does it taste sugary? No. Why? Because it has a gigantic amount of salt, which counteracts the sugar in your taste. But both of those things, when they get into our bodies, make us go, whoa, this is awesome. Right? The McDonald's hamburger is engineered to get a response. Now, as a biological entity, we are easy to figure out. You can engineer the perfect food that will make us go crazy. Right? High fructose corn syrup is the perfect form of delivery of sugar to our system to make us respond. It's a terrible thing because it shuts down the hormone that tells you that you're full, which is to say that the more Coke you drink, the more you're fooling your body that you're not yet full, which is one of the reasons why people get so fat when they drink a lot of Coke. It's the Coke has a lot of calories, but also then they just say, oh, I'm not full. I should supersize my fries. Right? You probably had this experience. As a biological entity, we're relatively easy to figure out, and food engineers combined with biologists are able to figure out what works for us, which is why the McDonald's hamburger is spreading throughout the world. As a psychological entity, what captures us is more complex, and there's probably not a single thing. But there are certain things that are true. Hate is easier to generate than love. Fear is easier to exploit than whatever the opposite of fear is. What's the opposite of fear? Courage. Right? Security. It's much easier, we are much easier to scare than to calm. So, in general, the things that work through this conduit, the things that capture us as an audience, tend to be much more negative, which is one of the reasons why politics is more negative. Most of our interaction with politics is public officials mediated through the media, the struggle of interest groups mediated through the media, and what captures an audience tends to be more negative. People hate negative campaigning. Why don't politicians give it up? Because it works. Because people really don't hate it. They bemoan it, but they don't actually hate it. They don't throw it up, right? Now, I've trained my body to throw up a McDonald's hamburger. I now have gotten to the point, and it took 2 decades, I've gotten to the point where the smell of a McDonald's Quarter Pounder makes me feel gross. But for the bulk of my life, the smell of a McDonald's Quarter Pounder made me salivate. And you probably had that experience. Many of you have. The guy who did Supersize Me, Morgan Spurlock, he said that when he has kids, when they drive by McDonald's, he's going to turn around and punch the kids. Because he wants them to have a negative reinforcement. Because in my family, as in many families, we got to go to McDonald's on special occasions. So if we were good, or if it was our birthday, I can't believe we went to McDonald's on my birthday. But it's like, McDonald's on your birthday. You learn that, plus it's engineered to have that response. I have had to train my body and my mind to respond negatively, to just really literally get sick at the idea of a McDonald's cheeseburger. I'm not salivating right now. Some of you maybe are. But I'm just like, ugh. But that's not natural. You have to train yourself to respond well to positive messages in the media and to train yourself to respond poorly to negative messages, because typically that's not how we function. Even if somebody tells you that the thing that you heard was a lie and they prove it to you and you believe them, you will still believe it a little bit. That's how our brains work. But we are much more complicated psychological organisms than biological organisms. So no one can design the media to be perfect. You can't decide. You can't say, okay, I'm going to go out and create the next viral video. You just make your stupid stuff, put it on YouTube, and you look, and maybe the next day there's 150,000 hits. Or maybe not. You have no idea, absolutely no idea, whether that's going to happen or not. There are certain things you can do. If you have tons of money, you can get 100,000 people to look at your little video because you buy an ad, right? So obviously, money and connections have an influence over this. But this particular conduit is really a large influence on how things are seen and perceived. But the media itself is a conduit. Think about if you were a public official, if you were a politician, what are you going to do? You're going to pay attention to the interest group struggle. You're going to try to respond to it in a way that will generate voters. Because for the most part, if you're a successful politician, you want to win re-election. That's a kind of a given. If you don't want to win re-election, then you're not going to be around for very long. One of the interesting things about the Tea Party candidates is that many of them have said, they said right away, as soon as they get elected, I'm going to do what I think is right without being concerned about re-election or being concerned about whether it's popular or not. Now that's admirable, but it means that your life cycle as a political actor is short. You're one of those flies that's born, mates, and dies within 6 hours, right? In political time, if you serve 1 2-year term in Congress, you don't exist in the political system. To have an impact, to really have an impact, you have to get reelected constantly because almost nothing happens in 2 years. And so politicians can get elected without caring about reelection, but then once they're not reelected, They're not public officials anymore, so they disappear. So in order to be part of this, you have to be reelected. As I say, the vote is the fundamental thing, but it's this struggle, which is aimed almost more at convincing voters than it is at influencing politicians, that matters. So for the rest of this class, or at least for the first part of the class, keep in your mind as the backdrop for what drives the struggle among different interest groups to convince people to vote for politicians or candidates who are in line with their views. That's the background condition. That's the main force. Now, one of the nice things about American politics is that because we have so many different interest groups, and because they're so competing and so conflicting, there's not, we don't have some homogeneous system. It's not just corporate influence. There's plenty of corporate influence, but there's plenty of other influence. We have gigantic unions that have interests that are in conflict with corporations. We have gigantic organizations like the NRA and Greenpeace and pro-life organizations and all of these that have interests that are in conflict with corporate interests and with each other. So we don't get an answer. What does the American people want? There's no answer. These groups are struggling to win policy outcomes. But no one ever wins for good, because there's always the struggle. Politics is a constant struggle